Providence Creek, October 1888. They had a name for her now. In the quiet moments between the clang of the blacksmith's hammer and the gossip that drifted from the general store porch, they called her Dirt Girl. Elspeth didn't have to hear it directly, she felt it in the way mothers pulled their children a little closer when she passed, in the tight, pitying smiles that didn't reach anyone's eyes. At 18, orphaned by the fever that had claimed her parents the winter before, she was already an object of communal sorrow. But this new behavior, this obsession, had turned their pity to suspicion. For 6 weeks, from sunup to sundown, she had been digging. Not a new well, not a root cellar, but a massive, gaping pit directly beneath the floorboards of her family's big, timber-framed barn. The pile of dark, rich earth grew by the day, a monument to her madness. Mr. Thorne, whose land bordered hers and who had known her father for 20 years, was the first to confront her directly. He stood at the edge of the excavation, his stout frame casting a long shadow over her work. She was caked in soil, her face streaked with sweat and grime, her braid a dusty rope down her back. "Elspeth," he said, his voice a low rumble of concern. "This has to stop. The whole town is talking. A hole this size, you're undermining the foundation posts. The first heavy snow will bring the whole roof down on your head." She paused, leaning on her shovel, and looked up at him. Her eyes, clear and startlingly blue in her dirt-smeared face, held no trace of the wildness he expected. They held only a weary resolve. "The barn will stand, Mr. Thorne." "I know what I'm doing, know what you're doing," he scoffed, gesturing at the cavernous pit. "You're digging your own grave, is what you're doing." "For what? What earthly reason could you have for this folly?" Elspeth wiped a forearm across her brow, leaving another streak of mud. She looked past him, toward the distant mountains already dusted with the first hint of white. "I'm not digging a grave, sir. I'm planting a garden." The absurdity of the statement left him speechless. A garden? Underground? As the cold winds of autumn stripped the last leaves from the cottonwood trees, the whispers grew louder. Dirt Girl and her folly. They didn't know that their judgment, their laughter, and their fears were all just noise. They couldn't see the cold that was coming, a cold deeper and longer than any of them remembered. And they had no idea that their survival would soon depend entirely on the impossible garden growing in the dark, right under their feet. If you want to understand how a lone girl, armed with nothing but a shovel and a strange inheritance of knowledge, could see a truth that an entire town missed, you have to look beneath the surface. You have to understand that Elspeth wasn't just digging in the dirt, she was listening to it. Her knowledge wasn't from a book or a schoolhouse. It came from her grandfather, a man she'd barely known, a quarryman from the slate-grey hills of Wales who had followed a dream of granite and gold to America. He had brought with him not treasure, but a profound understanding of the earth. He taught her father, and her father taught her, that the world had two surfaces. There was the one they all lived on, the one battered by blizzards and scorched by the sun. But there was another surface, a hidden one, that lay just a few feet below. Down there, past the reach of the frost, the earth held a steady, quiet warmth, a deep and abiding memory of summer. "The ground keeps its promises," her father used to say, his hands tracing patterns in the soil. "It never forgets the sun." He had planned to build it himself, this sunken sanctuary, but the fever came first. It took him and her mother in the space of a week, leaving Elspeth with the farm, the barn, and the weight of a promise whispered on a deathbed. "Don't let the white hunger take you, Elspeth," he had rasped, his breath a faint cloud in the frigid air of their cabin. "Remember the earth." So she dug. She was not driven by madness or grief, but by a clear, cold certainty. The problem with winter on the frontier wasn't just the snow or the wind. It was the freezing of everything vital. It was the way the cold crept into the cellars and turned potatoes to black mush and carrots to brittle ice. It was the way it stole the life from the very ground, making it impossible to grow anything for 5 long months. Everyone else fought the winter with fire, burning through their precious woodpiles just to keep from freezing in their sleep. They saw winter as an enemy to be battled. Elspeth, guided by her father's wisdom, saw it differently. The fight wasn't against the cold air above, it was about reaching for the constant warmth below. That was the secret. The solution wasn't to build thicker walls or bigger fires. It was to go down. The opposition wasn't just quiet mockery, it became a daily trial. Mr. Thorne, convinced he was acting out of neighborly duty, made his visits a ritual. The ground is settling unevenly, Elspeth. I can see it from my field. The west corner of the barn is already a full inch lower. She would thank him for his concern and show him the heavy timber braces she had set, meticulously transferring the load from the original posts to a new foundation of flat stones at the bottom of her pit. He would just shake his head, muttering about the foolishness of youth. The most painful visits were from Mrs. Miller, a kind woman who had been her mother's closest friend. She would arrive with a small pot of stew or a loaf of bread, her face etched with worry. "Child, you're getting thin as a rail," she'd say, her eye scanning the cavern under the barn. "You can't live on determination alone. Please, stop this. Come stay with us until you've recovered." The unspoken words hung in the air, until the grief passes, until you're yourself again. Elspeth would accept the food with genuine gratitude, but her resolve never wavered. "I'm fine, Mrs. Miller. Truly. This is important." Her daughter, 10-year-old Clara, would often trail behind her mother, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. Unlike the adults, Clara didn't see madness. She saw a grand, secret project. "Is it a fort?" she whispered one afternoon, while her mother was trying to persuade Elspeth to board up the hole for the winter. Elspeth smiled, the first genuine smile in weeks. "Something like that," she answered. A fort for plants. The gossip in town reached its peak when she bartered 2 of her father's best tools for 3 large, salvaged window panes from a merchant passing through. The story, twisted in the telling, was that she was selling off her inheritance for useless scraps of glass. "Poor thing's lost her senses completely," they'd say at the general store, shaking their heads. "Selling good tools for broken windows." Her father would turn in his grave. Every nail she drove, every stone she placed, was an act of defiance against the chorus of doubt. Their voices were a constant hum in the background, but she tuned them out, focusing instead on the whisper of her father's words, "The ground keeps its promises." She was alone, utterly and completely, but she was not lost. She had a map, one that no one else could read. The work was brutal, a relentless battle of one small body against tons of ancient, compacted earth. She began by prying up a section of the barn's floorboards, creating an opening roughly 10 feet square. The first few feet were topsoil, dark and loose, but then she hit the dense, clay-like subsoil, studded with rocks that jarred her arms with every strike of the pickaxe. To haul the dirt out, she rigged a simple but effective pulley system to one of the high rafters. She would fill a heavy canvas bucket, pull it up hand over hand, dump it into a wheelbarrow, and cart it out to the ever-growing pile behind the barn. Her hands, once soft, became a landscape of blisters that burst, bled, and hardened into thick calluses. Her back ached with a fire that never quite went out, and at night, she would fall into her bed, too exhausted to eat, her sleep a dreamless void of darkness and weight. She measured her progress not in days, but in depth. For feet down, the air began to feel different, cooler but also still, protected from the biting wind above. This was the start of the frost line, the zone of seasonal change. She had to go deeper. At 6 feet, the soil's temperature became noticeably stable. Even on a warm afternoon, the earth she dug from this level felt cool and constant. On a cold morning, it felt strangely warm to the touch. This was the heart of the principle, the tangible proof of her father's teaching. She was entering the earth's quiet sanctuary. Her final goal was a depth of 8 feet, well below the deepest frost the region had ever known. The final dimensions of the pit were immense for a single person to dig, 30 feet wide and 40 feet long, a subterranean room carved by sheer will. As she dug, she worked around the barn's massive support posts, leaving thick columns of earth around them. She knew Mr. Thorne was right about one thing: the barn's weight was a deadly threat. But she wasn't ignoring it, she was preparing for it. The growing pit became her entire world. The scent of damp earth filled her lungs, a smell of life and decay, of minerals and ancient patience. She felt like she was burrowing not just into the ground, but into a deeper understanding of the world itself, a truth that was solid, reliable, and hidden from the fleeting judgments of the people above. Once the excavation was complete, the truly difficult work began, making the space permanent and safe. The earthen walls, while stable, could slump and collapse over time, especially when the spring thaw arrived. Using a stone sledge and a pry bar, she began collecting field stones from the edges of her property, the same stones her father had cleared from the fields year after year. She loaded them onto a small stone boat, a simple sledge she could drag, and hauled them to the barn. Then, painstakingly, she lowered them into the pit. She began building retaining walls, fitting the stones together without mortar, using a technique her grandfather had called dry stacking. It was a slow, deliberate art of finding the right stone for the right place, using gravity and friction to create a structure of immense strength. The walls rose slowly, a mosaic of grey and brown granite that transformed the raw pit into a structured room. Her next task was the most dangerous, securing the barn above. One by one, she addressed the massive timber posts that held up the roof. For each post, she would carefully dig out the column of earth she had left supporting it, and in its place, build a sturdy, square pier of the largest, flattest stones she could find. Once the pier was complete and solid, she would wedge heavy, cut timbers between the stone pier and the main support beam above, transferring the load of the barn from the temporary earth column to the permanent stone foundation. It was terrifying work. The barn groaned and creaked with every shift in weight. Sawdust would rain down from the rafters, and she would freeze, listening, her heart pounding, certain that this was the moment Mr. Thorne's prophecy would come true. But each time, the new supports held. The structure settled, and she could breathe again. The final piece of the design was light and air. She built a narrow, sunken staircase at one end, with a heavy, angled door at the top. This design created a cold trap, a deep spot where the heavier cold air would pool and settle, preventing it from flowing into the main growing area. For light, she used the 3 precious window panes. She built 3 sturdy wooden frames and set them into the barn floor, creating skylights that would channel the winter sun down into the darkness. She sealed the edges with pine tar, making them watertight. Lastly, she laid out a clever ventilation system using sections of clay drainage pipe, creating a slow, constant circulation of air to prevent dampness and mold. By early November, the space was ready. It was a strange, subterranean world, smelling of stone and damp earth. The light from the 3 skylights cast pale, shifting rectangles on the floor. It was not bright, but it was enough. With the last of her strength, she hauled dozens of wheelbarrows of rich topsoil and compost back down into the pit, spreading it a foot deep over the entire floor. She was finally ready to plant her garden. She chose her seeds with care: potatoes, carrots, and beets, whose value was in their roots, safe in the warm soil. She planted rows of hardy greens, kale and chard, whose leaves could tolerate the cool air. And in the brightest spot, directly under the largest skylight, she took a gamble, planting a few tomato vines she had carefully nurtured in pots. She knew they might not bear fruit, but their green, living presence was an act of faith. A week after she planted, the first serious frost of the season descended on Providence Creek. It was a hard, killing frost that turned the world white and brittle. In the morning, the last of the town's kitchen gardens were blackened ruins. Mrs. Miller came by later that day, her face grim. "Everything's gone," she said, handing Elspeth a small jar of preserves. "Every last squash vine, every bean plant. It's going to be a long winter." Elspeth nodded and, on an impulse, led her to the barn. She opened the heavy angled door and guided Mrs. Miller down the stone steps. The air in the sunken garden was cool and damp, but it was unmistakably alive. In the soft light, tiny green shoots were pushing up from the dark soil in neat rows. The kale seedlings were already unfurling their first true leaves. "Good heavens," Mrs. Miller whispered, her skepticism warring with the evidence before her eyes. Clara, who had followed them in, knelt down and gently touched a tiny green leaf. "It's not frozen," she said, her voice filled with wonder. But the wonder didn't spread. When Mrs. Miller described the scene to her husband, he just shook his head. "A warm pocket in the earth," he reasoned. "It won't last. When the real cold comes, the ground will freeze solid, barn or no barn," the town agreed. It was a fluke, a temporary reprieve. Dirt Girl's folly was still a folly. They had no idea that this was just the overture. The real performance, the one that would change everything, was still waiting in the wings. The real cold arrived on the 23rd of December, not as a storm, but as an invading army. A mass of Arctic air slid down from the north and settled over the plains, silent and absolute. The temperature plummeted to 10 below zero, then 20, and stayed there. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, a cruel mockery of warmth. The snow began 2 days later, a relentless, fine powder that fell without wind, piling up in silent, geometric drifts. By New Year's Day, it was 4 feet deep on the level, and the supply trail to the south was completely impassable. Providence Creek was an island in a sea of white. At first, the town hunkered down, confident in their preparations. They had their stores of firewood, their salted meats, their cellars full of potatoes and squash. But the cold was unlike anything they had ever experienced. It was a physical presence, a predator that found every crack in their cabins, every chink in their resolve. It leached the heat from their fires, forcing them to burn through their woodpiles at an alarming rate. Worse, it began to invade their sanctuaries. The frost line, usually only 2 or 3 feet deep, was being driven down by the relentless sub-zero air. Soon, a terrible realization dawned in households across the town. The root cellars, the cool, dark places that were supposed to preserve their harvest, were failing. Mr. Thorne was the first to discover it. When he went to his cellar for a sack of potatoes, he found them frozen solid, hard as rocks and useless. When they thawed, they turned into a black, foul-smelling sludge. Panic set in. Families checked their own stores and found the same thing. The cold had breached their final defense. The apples were frozen, the carrots were frozen, the cabbages were brittle heads of ice. The white hunger had begun. It wasn't just the ache of an empty stomach, it was a deeper, more terrifying emptiness. It was the knowledge that there was no more food to be had, that the supply was finite and dwindling fast. Livestock, shivering in their pens, began to die, their water troughs frozen solid. The town grew quiet, the sounds of life replaced by the howl of the wind and the gnawing fear in their own bellies. They had fought the winter head-on, with fire and thick walls, and the winter was winning. By the end of January, desperation had curdled into a grim, quiet despair. The Miller family was down to their last sack of flour and a few strips of salted pork. Young Clara, weakened by the meager diet, had fallen ill with a persistent, racking cough that echoed in their small, cold cabin. Her face was pale and thin, her eyes large and listless. One evening, Mr. Miller looked at his wife, his own face a mask of helpless anguish. "There's nothing left," he said, his voice cracking. "We won't make it to spring." It was then that Mr. Thorne, his own family facing the same grim reality, made a decision. He had been a skeptic, a leader of the chorus of mockery against Elspeth. But he was also a practical man, and he was out of options. He gathered Mr. Miller and 2 other men. "We're going to check on the girl," he announced, his voice firm, daring them to object. "No one's seen her in weeks. If she's gone, her cabin might have something left. If she's alive, she's starving like the rest of us. It's our duty to check." Their journey across the snow-choked landscape was a brutal struggle. The snow was waist-deep, the wind a razor that cut through their thick coats, stealing their breath and burning their exposed skin. When they finally reached Elspeth's farm, it looked deserted, half buried in a monolithic drift of snow. They hammered on the cabin door, but there was no answer. A cold dread filled them. "The barn," Thorne said, pointing. They trudged to the massive structure, its roof heavy with snow, and pushed open the main doors. The air inside was cold, but still a relief from the biting wind. And then they saw it, the heavy, angled door set into the floorboards, a faint, almost imperceptible vapor rising from its edges. Thorne knelt and, with fumbling, frozen fingers, lifted the door. A wave of air washed over them. It was not warm, but it was cool, humid, and alive with the smell of damp earth and growing things. It was the smell of a spring thaw in the middle of a frozen hell. Elspeth appeared at the bottom of the stairs, holding a small lantern. She looked thin but healthy, her eyes clear. She simply looked at them, her expression unreadable. "Come down," she said quietly. Hesitantly, the four men descended the stone steps. They emerged into a space of impossible green. Rows of kale and chard stood lush and vibrant. The feathery tops of carrots and beets pushed up from the dark soil. And in the corner, hanging from staked vines, were clusters of pale but distinct tomatoes. The men stood in stunned silence, their breath fogging in the cool air, their faces illuminated by the lantern's glow. They had walked from a world of white death into a secret world of green life. Mr. Thorne, the staunch skeptic, slowly took off his glove and reached down to touch the dark, moist soil. It was cool, but it was soft and yielding. It was alive. He looked up at Elspeth, his eyes shining with a mixture of awe and profound shame. "How?" he whispered, the single word encompassing a universe of questions. The story of the underground garden spread through Providence Creek not like a rumor, but like a revelation. The men returned not with scavenged food, but with a story so unbelievable it had to be true. That evening, a small, humble delegation of townsfolk, led by Mr. Thorne, made their way to Elspeth's barn. They didn't come to demand or to take, they came to ask. Elspeth met them at the top of the stairs, her face calm. She listened as Mr. Thorne, his voice thick with emotion, apologized on behalf of the whole town. "We were fools, Elspeth," he said, his gaze unwavering. "We mocked what we didn't understand. Now, we're asking for your help." A part of her, the part that had endured weeks of isolation and ridicule, wanted to turn them away, to hoard the life she had cultivated in secret. But looking at their gaunt, desperate faces, at the fear in their eyes, she saw not the people who had scorned her, but the community her parents had loved. She saw Mrs. Miller, weeping quietly in the back, and thought of Clara's cough. Her resolve softened. She agreed to help, but not in the way they expected. She would not simply hand out food. "Giving you vegetables will feed you for a day," she said, her voice clear and steady, echoing her father's practical tone. "But understanding the principle will keep you alive." She brought them all down into the garden and began to teach. She explained the simple, profound truth of the Earth's stable temperature. She showed them how the stone walls held the heat, how the sunken entrance trapped the cold. They listened with the rapt attention of students who knew their lives depended on the lesson. The first thing she did was organize a rationing system for her own harvest. Each family would receive a share, enough to supplement their meager diet and keep sickness at bay. The first basket went to the Millers. The sight of fresh green kale and bright orange carrots brought tears to Mrs. Miller's eyes. But Elspeth's most important contribution was a new idea. It was too late to build more sunken gardens, but it wasn't too late to save what little food they had left. She taught the men how to dig small, deep pits, earth caches, inside their own barns or sheds, digging past the frost line. They could then store their remaining salted meat and the few root vegetables that hadn't yet frozen, protecting them in the earth's steady embrace. The town, once fractured by gossip and fear, was now united in a common purpose. The sound of shovels hitting frozen ground echoed through Providence Creek, but this time, it was the sound of hope. They worked together, sharing tools and labor, guided by the quiet wisdom of the young woman they had once called Dirt Girl. When the spring thaw finally came in late April, melting the great mountains of snow into rushing torrents of water, Providence Creek was still standing. They were thinner, wearier, and marked by the hardship, but they were alive. Not a single person had been lost to the white hunger that had reportedly devastated other, more isolated settlements. Their survival was a testament not to their stores of firewood or their hunting skills, but to the rows of kale and carrots that had grown stubbornly in the dark beneath an old barn. The name Dirt Girl was still used for Elspeth, but its meaning had been transformed. It was no longer an insult whispered behind her back. It was a title, spoken with a deep and abiding reverence. She was Dirt Girl, the one who understood the soil, the one who had listened to the earth when no one else would. That summer, the fields around Providence Creek were a flurry of activity. But the people weren't just planting corn and beans. Guided by Elspeth, 3 other families began digging their own sunken gardens, bigger and more ambitious than the original. Mr. Thorne, now her most devoted student, worked tirelessly, meticulously laying his stone walls, asking her advice on ventilation and light. The project became a communal effort, a symbol of their new understanding. Elspeth, once an outcast, was now the quiet center of her community, a reluctant teacher whose strange knowledge had become their most valuable asset. She never boasted or reminded them of their past foolishness. She simply shared what she knew, finding a quiet satisfaction in seeing the principles her father had taught her take root in the minds of others. The story of Providence Creek and its winter of survival became a local legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of dismissing the unfamiliar. But its lesson runs deeper than that. Long after the last of its residents were gone, the principle Elspeth rediscovered remains a fundamental truth. What she called the Earth's warmth, we now call geothermal energy. Her sunken garden was a primitive form of a geothermal greenhouse, a way of working with the planet's natural systems instead of fighting against them with brute force. Her story is a parable for our own time. It reminds us that often, the most elegant and powerful solutions are not found in complex new technologies, but in a simpler, deeper understanding of the world that is already here. It reminds us that wisdom is sometimes buried, waiting for someone with the courage to ignore the scorn of the crowd and start digging. The answers are often right under our feet, if only we have the humility to look down.